Chocobos and summon spells are now pretty common vernacular in the gaming community. And while some of you might not know what a Cactuar or Malboro is, you probably have heard of Final Fantasy by now. And we certainly see its influence all over the media in other games, movies, and TV shows. What's up everyone, I'm Jacob with the Leaderboard, and today we're going to take a look at the top 11 references to Final Fantasy in pop culture. There's a bunch of Final Fantasy references throughout Robot Chicken, whose writers are obviously obsessed with nerd culture and video games. It's also one of the only shows to do a full-on parody sketch about Final Fantasy. Many fans may remember the surprisingly accurate bit titled Final Fantasy Burger Chain. In the sketch, Cloud Strife works at a burger stand with Tifa and battles a potato to make french fries. Later, he also has to fight the villainous Sephiroth, no longer the game's final boss, but Cloud's actual boss, who fights Cloud using unpaid overtime. The animation style, music, and text boxes are all remarkably similar to the gameplay of Final Fantasy VII. And amusingly, the sketch also features Tifa Lockhart's US voice actress Rachel Lee Cook, who you might remember from classic teen films like She's All That. She's also a recurring cast member of Robot Chicken. Honestly, all things considered, this might be the best interpretation of Final Fantasy outside of the video games. Besides this sketch, Robot Chicken featured a sketch in which they had Cloud, again from Final Fantasy VII, singing about dressing up for the bathhouses in a Grand Theft Auto The Ballad of Gay Tony parody, and a sketch called Spring of the Drowned Girl, where the nerd character dresses up as a variety of female video game characters, including Tifa Lockhart. WWE wrestler Xavier Woods, not to be confused with the Dallas Cowboys player of the same name, is best known as a member of the group The New Day. But any WWE fan also knows that he's a huge fan of video games and Final Fantasy in particular, as he's taken every possible chance to show off his love for the franchise. In online interviews, Xavier's shown off his Final Fantasy VII replica Buster Sword, which was a gift from fellow New Day member Kofi Kingston. On WWE Raw, Xavier showed that he can play the Victory fanfare on trombone, and in perhaps the craziest of all of our Final Fantasy pop culture references, Wrestlemania 33, which was sponsored by Final Fantasy XIV, featured the entire New Day tag team dressed up as Final Fantasy archetypes. Woods dressed as a monk, Kofi Kingston dressed as a red mage, and Big E was a samurai. Kofi was also adorned with stuffed Moogles and rode on a Chocobo-themed ice cream cart. Overall, it was a very unique reference to Final Fantasy in a medium that isn't usually associated with JRPGs. You may not remember Jackie Kashian's special on Comedy Central back in 2003, but Jackie, who's now known as a friend and tour partner of Maria Bamford, had a rather famous bit in her special about Final Fantasy, or at least one of the many Final Fantasy spin-offs. In her routine, Jackie jokes that she has to fight God at the end of the Final Fantasy legend and concludes that it might be the dumbest end to any game she's ever played. In her defense, the game was criticized for having a poor ending, and Mass Effect 3 hadn't come out yet because it was 1989, and it should also be mentioned that the Final Fantasy legend is barely a Final Fantasy game, as it's really part of the Saga series, but it shares the Final Fantasy namesake, so we're going with it. Besides, Jackie also said that she still spent 80 hours playing it, a day of which was just trying to fight God with her 4 little guys, so yeah, that sounds like a Final Fantasy to me. Quick one, but totally worth a mention. The band Trivium is really into Final Fantasy, especially Final Fantasy VII. They like to use Divinity 1, a famous track from Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, as an opener for their live shows, and they also use the classic Final Fantasy VII track One Winged Angel as the outro. More interestingly, Matt Heafy, guitarist and singer of Trivium, has said that he would love to do musical scores for Final Fantasy video games, but has no time off from Trivium for such activities. Then again, we heard Florence and the Machine on Final Fantasy 15, so maybe Trivium on Final Fantasy 16 isn't such a crazy idea? Besides the Buster Sword and Aerith's death, 20-year-old spoiler alert, sorry about that, crazy hairstyles seem to be the most iconic things about Final Fantasy VII, and as a result, they're featured in a bunch of fighting games. Namco alone has at least 3 games where you can customize with some Final Fantasy hair. In Soul Calibur 4, Tekken 6, and Tekken 7, it's possible to recreate either Cloud or Sephiroth's hair. In Soul Calibur 4, people have even gone so far as to try to mimic the sword and fighting styles of the characters. There's more than one video on YouTube about it if you're interested. And when Mortal Kombat added character customization in Mortal Kombat Armageddon, they also included Final Fantasy VII hairstyles, which you can purchase under the names Anime 1 for Cloud and Fantasy for Sephiroth. Seems pretty appropriate. Chocobos are a Final Fantasy icon. Some people have even gone so far as to consider them the symbol of the series. They were introduced by Squaresoft in Final Fantasy II, so they haven't been with the games from day one. However, since they were introduced, they've been a constant in every Final Fantasy game. But they've also been layered into the world of another famous Squaresoft series, the cult classic Mana. Mana fans will know that Chocobos appear in many Mana games. However, with Legend of Mana, Squaresoft did an even larger tie-in with Final Fantasy. While Chocobos are available in the game game for every player, you can only obtain yellow chocobos as a pet if you also had a Final Fantasy VIII save on your memory card. It's pretty crafty synergy. How could the largest Nintendo enterprise do an RPG parody without bringing up Final Fantasy? Don't worry, cause they didn't. In fact, Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars has a couple Final Fantasy references. The most basic is that Bahamut, based on the dragon Bahamut from Final Fantasy, is a boss in Bowser's Keep, though he's a little less intimidating than in the Final Fantasy games. In an even more detailed and layered reference, there's a secret boss in Monstro Town called Culex. Culex is a Dark Knight who fights alongside 4 crystals. Sound familiar? The fight even uses musical themes from Final Fantasy IV during the battle sequence, and just in case the reference wasn't obvious enough, they really hammer it home with victory fanfare and even prelude music after. This is a really quick one, but it's such a small and memorable nod to Final Fantasy that we had to bring it up. In the World of Warcraft expansion Wrath of the Lich King, there's a flower vendor in the city of Dalaran named Aerith Primrose. That's all it is, but you tell us that that NPC doesn't remind you of the Final Fantasy VII opening. This video's opening up all kinds of wounds. Okay, another quick one. Yes, there's a lot of quick ones today. That's what happens when a franchise permeates all of pop culture. In the indie game Undertale, there's a more veiled Final Fantasy reference that some gamers may have missed. However, for those of you who've played Final Fantasy VI, the opera scene in Undertale looks and sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Yes, this sequence is in fact a musical homage to the opera scene from Final Fantasy VI. The music, the font, and even the dialogue are all reminiscent of the infamously long sequence of singing feelings. Scott Pilgrim probably contains the most Final Fantasy references of any piece of pop art, and why shouldn't it? It's a comic about a guy who's very into both video games and music. And when we think of great games with great music, Final Fantasy is at the front of that list. And there are, of course, some references to the series in the Scott Pilgrim comics, game, and film. To begin with, in the comics, Wallace directly references Final Fantasy when he comments on how he accidentally saved over Scott's Final Fantasy game again. This bit's also referenced in the movie. In a more subtle sequence that didn't make the film, Scott has to remember his past in a sequence that mimics Cloud trying to remember who he is and what memories are real in early Final Fantasy VII. In the Scott Pilgrim vs. the World video game, one of the helpful accessories you can obtain is called Never-Ending Fantasy, and this is a rather amusing jab at Final Fantasy considering the 15 editions and various other incarnations of this supposedly final game. And finally, in the Edgar Wright directed film Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Scott talks about and plays the bass line from the theme to Final Fantasy II. And when you hear it, if you immediately think, well, no, that's Final Fantasy IV, we should probably remind you that Final Fantasy IV was called Final Fantasy II when it was first released in North America. And just for the record, we don't know if Scott genuinely didn't know that, or if he was just trying to be a hipster by referring to its original release title. Based on Scott's character, I would believe either. How could we do a list of pop culture references and not at least mention the Final Fantasy movies? There have been quite a few over the years, at least 5 by our count, but let's focus on the 3 major ones. First, there was the theatrical release Final Fantasy Spirits Within, directed by Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi. It's almost completely unrelated to the Final Fantasy brand in style and substance. There's no summons, no large swords, and no chocobos, and the soundtrack was not made by a man named Nobuo despite fan protests. One reviewer said that the film still does manage to fit into the Final Fantasy brand name because a party of heroes averts impending global holocaust by drawing on their individual skills, gaining knowledge through challenges, and emerging victorious with newfound love and respect for themselves and their companions. Well, we still wish that there were mages, alright? Hironobu thought that this film would be the start of Square Pictures and a whole series of games and movies starring the lead character, Aki, but it didn't work out that way. While Aki was used to pitch a short film that would become the Flight of the Osiris in the Animatrix, she was never heard from again after that. And in 2002, just a year after Spirits Within's release, Square Pictures folded. Thankfully, that wasn't the end of Final Fantasy films. In 2005, Square Enix released the mostly well-received Final Fantasy Advent Children, a straight-to-video sort of sequel to Final Fantasy VII which envisions the characters years later fighting around a city. There's some great animation and music, but it's hard to say that this film added a lot to the Final Fantasy VII story. Still, it shows off what Square Enix can do given the proper material. And finally, there was the minor theatrical and major VOD release Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV, which featured the voices of Aaron Paul, or Jesse Pinkman in Breaking Bad, plus Game of Thrones alums Lena Headey and Sean Bean, and a whole bunch of Final Fantasy XV voice actors. It was basically a 2-hour prequel for the new game, which a lot of people complained about, but it's still more Final Fantasy XV, and really, that's still a win. Either way, we're hoping that this wasn't the end of Final Fantasy's attempts at making movies, as they're historically good at telling original stories and are bound to get the formula right sooner sooner or later. That's all the time we have for today. Once again, I'm Jacob, and thanks for watching Final Fantasy references in pop culture. And I'm sure there are literally thousands that we've missed, so make sure to leave them in the comments below. And yes, we didn't even try to cover Kingdom Hearts because really that's more of a Final Fantasy spin-off than a sequel, so on top of being too obvious, there's also way too much stuff. But which ones do you want to see in our next reference video? Comment below and let us know. Don't forget to click that little bell icon next to the subscribe button to become part of our notification squad, and if you like getting more from your games, subscribe to the Leaderboard, your home for video game facts.